Picture this, it's 1960. Patrice Lumumba, the first democratically elected Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo, stands before a jubilant crowd. The air is electric. Independence has finally arrived. The shackles of colonial rule, after decades of brutal oppression, have been cast off. In his voice, there's defiance and pride. In his words, a vision of a Congo that would no longer serve foreign masters and its riches harnessed for its own people. But within months, just 6 months, Lumumba is dead. His body, dismembered and dissolved in acid, has vanished into history. This was no random act of violence. It was a calculated, international operation. The CIA, Belgian operatives, local elites. Why? Because his dream of true freedom threatened the global order. Fast forward to today. Congo sits atop $24 trillion worth of natural resources, gold, diamonds, cobalt. Yet, most of its citizens live on less than $2 a day. Tech giants like Apple and Tesla rely on Congolese cobalt for their products, extracted from mines where children work without safety gear. And the people digging up these resources? They remain trapped in poverty. Does this sound like freedom to you? Does this look like independence? Africa's liberation was supposed to be a turning point, a chance for nations to reclaim their destinies. But more than 60 years later, the continent is still being bled dry. Not through colonial armies, but through economic dependencies and contracts, crushing debt, and international institutions masquerading as saviors. So, how did it come to this? How did the land with the richest resources on Earth become the poorest continent in the world? If independence was supposed to bring freedom, why are so many African nations still struggling under the weight of poverty and exploitation? In this video, we'll uncover the hard truths behind Africa's poverty. The invisible systems that perpetuate colonialism without flags or borders. The global powers that profit from Africa's misery. And the institutions that have turned independence into a mere illusion. Because here's the truth, colonialism never left. It simply evolved. And its grip on Africa has never been tighter. But to grasp how Africa's modern struggles are intricately tied to its colonial past, we must first uncover the roots of exploitation that laid the foundation for today's economic and political chains. Africa in the late 19th century wasn't just a land of opportunity, it was a target. European powers, driven by greed and an insatiable hunger for resources, set their sights on a continent rich in gold, diamonds, and fertile soil. They didn't come with diplomacy or trade, agreement or partnership in mind. They came with one goal, to take. So, in 1884, they gathered in Berlin to carve up Africa like a holiday feast. This meeting, known as the Berlin Conference, was not about negotiation with African leaders. In fact, not a single African representative was invited. Instead, Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, and others drew arbitrary lines across the continent, creating borders that ignored centuries of history, culture, and kinship. So, what was the result? Entire ethnic groups were split apart, forced into different colonies with new rulers. Others, who had no history of conflict, were thrown together and left to deal with the chaos that followed. These lines, drawn by foreign hands with foreign interests, would go on to shape Africa's conflicts, instability, and suffering for generations to come. But dividing the land was only the beginning. Once they claimed their territories, the Europeans unleashed a system of exploitation so ruthless it left entire societies shattered. They didn't see people, they saw labor. They didn't see cultures, they saw tools for their own enrichment. African economies were forcibly transformed into engines of extraction, designed to funnel wealth and resources out of the continent and into Europe. Nowhere was this exploitation more brutal than in the Congo under King Leopold II of Belgium. Leopold didn't just colonize the Congo, he owned it. This wasn't a Belgian colony, it was Leopold's personal fiefdom. Under his rule, the Congolese people were forced to extract ivory and rubber. Failing to meet quotas didn't just mean punishment, it meant mutilation or death. Entire families were massacred to send a message. In the span of just a few decades, millions, yes, millions, died. So why would a king go to such extremes? The answer is simple: profit. Rubber was in high demand during the industrial boom, and Leopold saw the Congo as his ticket to unimaginable wealth. By the time his reign of terror ended, the Congo was stripped of its people, its dignity, and its future. Yet, Leopold walked away a hero in Europe, celebrated for his contributions to civilization. But the Congo wasn't an isolated case. Across the continent, colonial powers built economies that served only one purpose: to feed Europe's industrial machine. African farmers were forced to grow cash crops like cotton, cocoa, and tea, crops they couldn't eat and that were exported entirely to Europe. Meanwhile, industries that could have processed these materials locally were deliberately stifled. Why let Africa build its own wealth when Europe could simply take it? And the damage didn't stop at economics. Traditional African governance systems, centuries in the making, were dismantled and replaced with centralized colonial administrations. These weren't built to serve the people, they were built to control them. The goal was clear: crush resistance, extract resources, and maintain dominance. Therefore, when we talk about the instability that plagues parts of Africa today, we must remember, these divisions and governance models weren't accidents. They were deliberate. Colonial powers sowed division to weaken resistance and maintain their grip on the continent. And when independence finally came, African nations were left with these fractured systems and borders, expected to build stable societies out of the chaos they inherited. These systems didn't just strip Africa of its wealth, they ensured its struggles would last for generations. But how did they manage to keep exploiting Africa even after independence? When the colonial powers left Africa, they didn't just walk away. Sure, they packed their flags and their armies, but they didn't leave empty-handed. They took the continent's wealth, its resources, and its pride. But here's the kicker: they left something behind: a system. A system designed to keep Africa under their thumb, without the need for soldiers or empires. This system? Neocolonialism, control and disguise, and its grip is just as suffocating as ever. So, how does it work? It all starts with money. After independence, African nations were desperate to build their nation. They needed infrastructure, roads, schools, hospitals, industries. But colonialism had drained their resources, leaving them with nothing to rebuild. That's when the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank entered. They presented themselves as saviors, offering loans to help Africa rebuild. But here's the catch: these loans weren't free. They came with strings attached. And those strings would strangle Africa's development for decades. Take Ghana, one of Africa's most promising nations after independence. In the 1980s, it turned to the IMF for financial help. In return, it was forced to implement structural adjustment programs. That meant cutting government spending, privatizing public services, and opening its markets to foreign competition. The result? Public hospitals and schools were gutted, local industries collapsed, and Ghana became even more dependent on foreign imports. Therefore, instead of fostering growth, these programs trapped nations in a cycle of debt and dependency. The money borrowed was often used to pay off previous loans, not to invest in the future. And the interest rates? They were sky-high, ensuring these countries could never fully repay their debts. But debt wasn't the only tool of neocolonialism. Former colonial powers also created systems to keep their ex-colonies economically tied to them. Look at the CFA franc, a currency used by 14 African countries. It was introduced by France during colonial rule and is still controlled by the French treasury today. These nations can't print their own money or set their own monetary policy. Every major economic decision must go through Paris. And what happens when African leaders try to fight back? The system doesn't tolerate dissent. Just look at Patrice Lumumba, Congo's first democratically elected leader. Lumumba had a vision: Congo's wealth, its gold, diamonds, and cobalt, should serve its people, not foreign corporations. But that vision made him dangerous. In 1961, Just months into his leadership, he was assassinated in a conspiracy involving the CIA, Belgian operatives, and local elites. His crime? Demanding true independence. Lumumba's story is not unique. Across the continent, leaders who resist neocolonial control face exile, coups, or worse. Meanwhile, those who play by the rules of foreign powers, protecting outside interests, are rewarded. Puppet regimes ensure that Africa's riches flow outward, leaving its people in poverty. Take Zambia, for example. The country is rich in copper, a resource vital to global tech industries. But under IMF pressure, Zambia was forced to privatize its copper mines in the 1990s. Today, these mines are controlled by foreign corporations. The profits? They go overseas, leaving local communities to struggle with unemployment, pollution, and poverty. And Zambia is not alone. Across Africa, this story repeats itself, nations rich in resources but unable to reap the benefits. Instead, they are saddled with debt, reliant on foreign aid, and trapped in agreements that prioritize foreign profits over local prosperity. The story doesn't stop there. Let's move to Niger, a country that holds some of the world's largest deposits of uranium, an essential ingredient for nuclear power. Niger's uranium has fueled energy needs across Europe for decades, but ironically, the majority of Niger's population has no access to electricity. The wealth extracted from its mines rarely benefits the people. Instead, foreign companies pay minimal taxes, leaving Niger stuck in poverty despite its incredible resource wealth. So, when nations can't make their own decisions because they're beholden to creditors, when their resources are exploited by foreign companies, and when their economies are designed to serve others instead of themselves, can we really call that independence? The truth is, neocolonialism operates in plain sight. It doesn't need armies or warships. It uses contracts, loans, and institutions. And its impact is just as devastating as the colonial rule it replaced. But this is not the end. Even the world global trade policy is designed not to favor Africa. Africa fuels the global economy with raw materials, cocoa, cotton, oil, rare minerals, the very lifeblood of modern industries. Yet, while these resources generate billions worldwide, the continent sees little more than crumbs. How did we get here? The answer is so disturbing. Africa operates in an economic system designed to keep it perpetually dependent, exporting raw materials and importing costly finished goods. This imbalance isn't a coincidence, it's a strategy. Take cocoa, the backbone of a $100 billion chocolate industry. West Africa produces nearly 70% of the world's cocoa beans. Farmers in Ghana and Ivory Coast work grueling hours under blistering sun, but here's the kicker: they receive less than 6% of a chocolate bar's price. Why? Because the real profits aren't in farming cocoa, they're in processing it and selling chocolate. And guess where that happens? Europe and North America. But why doesn't Ghana just produce its own chocolate? Surely it's not that complicated. The problem lies in global trade policies. Western nations impose massive tariffs on processed goods like chocolate but none on raw cocoa beans. So, if Ghana were to export its own chocolate, it would face crippling costs that make competing on the global market nearly impossible. Meanwhile, European and American companies enjoy subsidies, further widening the gap. This isn't unique to cocoa. It's the same story with cotton, coffee, and countless other resources. African nations sell their raw materials cheap and buy back finished goods at steep prices. This cycle siphons wealth out of Africa and into foreign economies, ensuring Africa remains a supplier, never a producer. And then there's the issue of currency. Many African nations are tied to the CFA franc, a relic from colonial times controlled by France. It's pegged to the euro, giving these countries little control over their monetary policies. They can't devalue their currency to make exports competitive and are forced to keep significant reserves in France. In effect, their economies are at the mercy of decisions made in Paris. So, when we talk about Africa's economic struggles, it's not just about corruption or bad governance. It's about systems deliberately built to keep Africa from climbing the value chain. Think about it, African farmers grow most of the world's cocoa, yet Europe dominates the chocolate industry. Niger has vast uranium reserves, yet its people lack electricity while their uranium powers French homes. The fallout from these imbalances is devastating. With so much wealth drained away, African nations rely on foreign aid and loans to plug the gaps. They struggle to invest in infrastructure, healthcare, or education. And when they try to break free, when they attempt to process their resources or renegotiate unfair trade deals, they face swift economic retaliation. But imagine if this cycle were broken. What if Ghana became a global leader in chocolate production? What if Niger controlled its uranium exports, using the profits to build schools, hospitals, and roads? The transformation would be monumental. Jobs would flourish, economies would expand, and for the first time, Africa's wealth would work for its people, not against them. Change isn't a pipe dream. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, is a bold step toward boosting intra-African trade and reducing dependence on external markets. But agreements alone won't dismantle deeply entrenched systems of exploitation. True progress requires a shift in how the world views and engages with Africa. So, here's the ultimate question: will the world continue to profit off Africa's resources while leaving its people behind? Or will it finally allow the continent to chart its own course? Because Africa doesn't lack wealth, it lacks control over it. But this disguised colonial system also includes something far more unsettling: external military destroyers who enter Africa in the camouflage of peacekeeping. When the Cold War came, it turned Africa into a chessboard for global powers. The United States and the Soviet Union poured in money and weapons, not to develop these nations, but to secure their allegiance. Entire countries became proxy battlegrounds, fueling civil wars and displacing millions, all for someone else's geopolitical gain. Military interventions soon became another tool of influence. Branded as peacekeeping missions or anti-terrorism campaigns, these operations often concealed ulterior motives. Take France's ongoing presence in West Africa. Officially, French troops are there to combat terrorism. But beneath the surface lies a web of economic ties, uranium mines, trade agreements, and industries that rely on these regions staying stable. Stable for whom? Certainly not for the locals, who often find themselves caught in the crossfire, their poverty and disenfranchisement ignored. Here's the twist: these so-called interventions rarely bring peace. Instead, they deepen instability, breeding resentment and, in some cases, even bolstering the extremist groups they claim to fight. And that's just the surface of the damage. The real cost? Sovereignty. When foreign powers assassinate leaders, control governments, and deploy troops, they rob nations of their agency. Decisions that should be made for African people are dictated by outsiders with their own agendas. The result? Generations of dependency, conflict, and underdevelopment. So, the question isn't just why this happens, but why it keeps happening. If these interventions were truly about peace and stability, why do they leave such chaos in their wake? And if foreign powers are genuinely interested in helping, why do their actions almost always seem to serve their own interests first? Now, Africa is in far more trouble than can be imagined. No, these are not the colonial masters but emerging powers that are ready to suck Africa dry. Africa's resources have always drawn global interest, but in recent years, the players have changed. Emerging powers, particularly China, have stepped into the spotlight, presenting themselves as development partners. They promise modern infrastructure, booming economies, and opportunities for growth. But beneath these promises lies a pressing question: is this a new form of colonialism? Let's start with China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, its multi-trillion-dollar global infrastructure project. In Africa, BRI has funded railways, ports, and highways, reshaping entire economies. Take Kenya's Standard Gauge Railway, SGR, a $3.6 billion project financed by China. On paper, it looked like a game-changer, a modern railway to boost trade and connectivity. But here's the reality: Kenya now faces mounting debt, and the railway hasn't generated enough revenue to cover its operating costs. Some critics warn that if the debt can't be repaid, Kenya risks losing control of key assets. But it's not just railways. Look at Zimbabwe. Its diamond-rich fields were meant to bring prosperity to its people. Instead, deals with Chinese firms have sparked controversy. Allegations of environmental damage, exploitative labor practices, and unfair profit-sharing agreements have left many questioning who truly benefits. The diamonds leave Zimbabwe, but the poverty stays. So, how does this differ from the West's colonial exploits? Historically, Western nations seized control with armies and flags, exploiting people and resources openly. China, in contrast, presents its involvement as cooperative, offering loans and building infrastructure. Yet the outcomes often echo colonialism, heavy debt and foreign dominance in key sectors. That's why terms like debt trap diplomacy are becoming alarmingly common. Countries are left with massive obligations and few ways out. But let's be fair, some argue this is what Africa needs. Infrastructure. Investment. A shot at development that others have overlooked. Yet, as debts rise and control slips away, the risks become harder to ignore. It's a game of high stakes and tight deadlines. And China isn't alone in this. Emerging powers like Turkey, India, and Russia are also vying for influence. From mining contracts to military deals, the race for Africa's resources is intensifying. The question is, will these relationships uplift African nations or entangle them in yet another cycle of dependency? The clock is ticking. Africa faces a critical decision: to embrace these partnerships cautiously or risk repeating the mistakes of its colonial past. One thing is clear: control, no matter who holds it, always comes at a price. Internal factors, leadership and governance. Africa's challenges are not merely the result of external exploitation, they are deeply entwined with internal issues. Leadership and governance have often amplified the burdens left by colonialism, shaping a post-independence trajectory fraught with setbacks. But how much of this narrative is about external forces, and how much stems from within? Let's look closely into a name that echoes through history: Mobutu Sese Seko. His reign over Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, became a symbol of unchecked corruption. Over 32 years, Mobutu diverted billions, between $5 billion and $15 billion, from public funds into his personal luxuries. While the country's schools, hospitals, and roads were left to decay, Mobutu's kleptocracy thrived. By the time he was overthrown, Zaire's infrastructure was in shambles, and its people bore the weight of staggering debt. But Mobutu was not an anomaly. Across Africa, leaders forged alliances with foreign powers during the Cold War, trading sovereignty for military aid and financial backing. These alliances came at a cost: suppressing dissent, ignoring citizens' needs, and prioritizing policies that favored international benefactors over national progress. Why does corruption thrive so widely? The answer lies in the colonial legacy. At independence, African nations inherited governance systems designed to extract resources, not foster equality or accountability. These centralized, unyielding structures created fertile ground for exploitation. Even as colonial rulers exited, the blueprint for mismanagement remained entrenched. Yet, the story doesn't end there. Foreign powers have often acted as puppeteers, propping up corrupt regimes to secure their interests. Take Patrice Lumumba, a beacon of Congo's hope for independence. His assassination, orchestrated with the involvement of Western powers, underscored the lengths to which external forces would go to maintain control. Leaders who aligned with these powers were rewarded, while reformers faced elimination. This vicious cycle entrenches a singular focus among many leaders: retaining power at all costs. As corruption festers, trust erodes, and development stalls. Reformers who rise face daunting obstacles, both from entrenched systems within and external pressures that resist change. So, where does the responsibility lie? While external interference remains a significant factor, the impact of internal governance failures cannot be overlooked. Leaders like Mobutu flourished in systems lacking transparency and accountability, where power resided in the hands of a select few. the path forward is daunting. It requires more than condemning foreign exploitation. It demands rebuilding governance from the ground up, crafting institutions that prioritize the people, ensuring transparency, and fostering accountability. The road is long, but it is the only way to break free from the cycles of corruption and dependency that have long defined the continent's history. Now, think about this. What if this isn't just a post-colonial issue but the continuation of a global system built centuries ago? To fully understand how we got here, we need to go back to Africa's history from the 16th to the 20th century, to the secrets they tried to erase. How much of what we know today was shaped by what they didn't want us to see? Click on the video linked here to uncover the forgotten chapters of Africa's past and see how they connect to the chains we've explored today. History has a way of repeating itself, but only if we let it. If this video intrigues you, subscribe for more.